Most people hustle each and every single day, but nothing compounds. My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds for 116 days now, going up to 365. And in today's video, we're going to be going through how turning everyday work into a scalable flywheel ultimately powers how you're then able to build small repeatable actions that compound into massive impact while treating them as systems. So we're going to be going through why most people treat daily work as once-off tasks, how to treat each and every action as a part of the system that is ultimately compounding, and also what most people miss, as well as how I run my own personal flywheel and how I think about it, and as well as how you can start building your flywheel today. So if we start over here, why most people treat daily tasks or daily work as once-off task is simply because high effort doesn't automatically scale. You could be doing manual entries or doing day-to-day work, but that ultimately does not scale. And the problem comes in when you're ultimately doing all this work, but realizing that the work that you're doing cannot scale without you, because there are no repeatable systems, there are no procedures in place that ultimately govern how you're able to build out your systems. For example, with these daily videos, it's not just each and every single day I'm breaking down and just building from the ground up. There are scalable systems that I've put in place that automatically allows me to then record and then just upload straight away. And that ultimately means that having random actions ultimately equals limited leverage, because if you're constantly doing random things each and every single day, that ultimately is not creating as high leverage as you possibly can, because your days are not structured. Your work that you're doing is done in sprints or is scattered all over the place, and that ultimately results in limited leverage because you're not fully able to capture what high level tasks you need to do in a structured manner that ultimately becomes scalable. And that also means that the output doesn't compound without structure. I've seen this time and time again where just doing things and doing work ultimately does not scale, ultimately because there is no structure to it. It's just, oh, I'm just doing busy work, I'm just doing this work just to get it over and done with. But that ultimately long term is not scalable unless there's structure and procedures in place. So how do you actively think about this, and how I actively think about this is treating every action as part of a compounding system. And what I mean by this is having inputs, processing, and outputs, which I'm very, very big on in terms of thinking what are the inputs, what are the processes that are happening, and also what are the outputs that are coming out as a result of that. And if we look at how to treat every action as part of a compounding system and building that compounding leverage that scales with time, you basically see it as your inputs are your daily tasks, your ideas, your interactions, and experiments. So these are your daily things that you're doing, saying, hey, you're sending an email, you're generating ideas, you're doing idea generation, and also the interactions that you're having on a day-to-day, as well as the experiments that you may be running. So say, hey, you're running different experiments in terms of how to structure out your day, and you're trying different things, trying to find what works best for you, and those are the inputs that you're ultimately having within this system of your daily actions. And then by looking at that, we can then see what the next step, which are the processes. So what are the processes that ultimately formulate as a result of this, which are standardized workflows, where you can basically have a standard workflow that ultimately is super tailored to how you run your business and also how you run your life. And also automating and templating. This is one of the most important modes, to automate whatever you possibly can so that it removes you from the day-to-day manual work that it reduces your time that you could spend on high leverage tasks. Because if you're doing, like I mentioned in the beginning, where you're doing random actions each and every single day, that ultimately leads you to having limited leverage, and that limited leverage is not going to be scaled unless you have automation around that, and also templates of specific things that you're doing internally that ultimately scale. Because if you have templates, you can plug one and then ultimately use it to many. So it's a one-to-many tool that you can then use to ultimately scale and also free up your time as well. And then also tracking tracking and metrics, I'm a big proponent in terms of tracking data and having data, just gathering all of those data points, because data is the key to understanding how your specific business functions and how it's going to function into the future. You're not going to, succeed off of guesswork, and you're not going to succeed off of not knowing your numbers. And knowing your numbers is one of the most important modes in terms of building systems and also just tracking your day as well. I am such a big proponent in this. I've spoken about this multiple times in my earlier videos, where I was just saying, hey, these are the metrics that we need to make sure that we're tracking. We're understanding the data at a much deeper level, because that's ultimately going to allow us to understand how to move into the future, simply because we have those data points. And through that, we also need to make sure that we're running feedback loops. And there's so many things that ultimately require feedback loops, and making sure that we have the right feedback loops that ultimately refine our thinking, so that we're having these processes that we ultimately have, but we're also running feedback loops, because that also keeps us accountable in terms of are we doing the right thing, are we tracking the right things, and are we automating the right things, by solely just understanding how it's performing as well. Because if you don't run feedback loops, you're just going to be doing all these things and not really understanding if it's working or not, or you're gonna be doing it and it might be working, but you're not really gonna understand it from a fundamental perspective or a point of view why it's working. And if you understand why it's working, then you're then able to predict how it's gonna happen into the future. And this is also something that I've spoken about countless times in my previous videos, when I was mentioning about running those feedback loops and analyzing those patterns, simply because if you can analyze those patterns, you can then be able to predict, which is Chaos Killer OS, a predictive analysis tool that I mentioned previous, that we're still gonna fully build out and deck out when the time is right. But yeah, that is basically it. I think one of the most important things is also running those feedback loops, so then we can then move on to the outputs, which are then your predictable results. So you're then able to generate predictable results, so that you're not just working off of guesswork. So let's say if you run a specific automation, and this automation frees up 30% of your time on a day-to-day or even on a weekly basis, then that you ultimately have this predicted results, because it's given you those results in the past. And that ultimately means that you're not guessing all the time of what is going to be the result, and that is the worst place you want to be, always trying to do guesswork in terms of what the output is going to be and what the results are going to be. You need to somewhat obviously have some structure in terms of predicting how the results would be into the future, and also measurable progress, which is one of the most important things as well. You need to be able to measure how much progress you're making on a day-to-day, and also scaling workflows. If you're not able to scale your workflows, for example, like having one specific workflow that you can plug and it ultimately serves different functions, and it ultimately is scalable as well, then you're ultimately going to be trapped in this wheel where you're just going to have this workflow, but it's not going to be scalable, and in the end it's not going to save you as much time as it would if it was scalable. So then the question becomes, for this specific function, how can we create this workflow and make it as scalable as possible, and ensure that we're saving time so that we can focus on high leverage tasks. But that ultimately means that we're making sure that each completed cycle powers the next. So each input powers the output. So each input powers the processing, which ultimately powers the output, so that it's making sure that we're completing this cycle, and the knowledge, audience, and revenue and skills compound. Because one of the most important things is making sure that each and every single action that you're doing on a day-to-day is ultimately compounding in some shape or form, and you're also able to measure the compounding effect of that. Because if you're then not able to measure it, then you're not going to know how it's going to be into the future. You're just going to be shooting blank each and every single time, and not fully understanding how the system functions as a whole. But that means you focus on the inputs, which are basically, like I mentioned here, your daily tasks, ideas, interactions, and experiments. And then you move on to the processes, which are ultimately here, your standardized workflow, your automations and templating, tracking and metrics, as well as your feedback loops as well, which are all part of your processing. And then you ultimately get your output, outputs, which are ultimately your predictable results, your measurable progress, and your scalable workflows that you can, ultimately scale within your internal or external business use case, and also running those feedback loops. So basically those feedback loops that govern how you're then able to interpret the data and understand if you're doing the right thing, and just asking, why is this working, why is this not working, and just understanding that, because that ultimately powers how you're then able to build into the future. But that also means that what most people miss is that micro leverage points are ultimately a result of the small tweaks in routine that ultimately result in exponential gain. And you get audience signal, so basically documenting your work compounds credibility and learning. So if you're then able to document your learnings, your failures, your wins, then you're ultimately able to constantly learn and also improve as well. And that also builds credibility. It's not always just about showing the good, or it's not always just about showing the good things that are happening, but also using the bad things as tools and mechanisms in order to learn how to move into the future. Because if you're constantly documenting, there's no way that you're not going to be able to fully succeed if you're just going deep into it and making sure that each and every single time you're being a lifelong learner. And this is one of the most important things, to understand that even the smallest of tweaks can ultimately result in exponential gain. It's just understanding what those small tweaks need to be. Are they measurable as well? And can you ultimately lead them to be compounding in a way that ultimately gets you those exponential gains? And if you're able to answer those questions, then you're able to then make and find those small tweaks. But that ultimately means you need to also make sure that the energy is aligned. What this means is that you're protecting high value actions to keep your flywheel spinning faster. Because if you're focusing on the low value tasks and daily actions, then you're not going to be able to spin the wheel as fast as you possibly can. And like I always say, and like what everyone else says, speed is key. Speed in business, speed in life is super key. Being able to be the first and the best also as well is also super important. And if you're constantly building or focusing on the low leverage tasks, then you're not going to be able to scale your output to the level that it's supposed to be scaled, and the competition will ultimately take a hold of that. But that ultimately means that you're also iterating as well, with every iteration improving the speed and quality. Because if you're then able to iterate each and every single day rapidly, like I'm doing with these daily videos, each and every single day is a mode for me to rapidly iterate my ideas, my thinking, how I'm also learning as well. And that using that as a mode constantly allows you to fail fast and also win even bigger. And understanding that most people miss this, but that ultimately means that it's leverage that you can ultimately create for yourself. So the question then becomes, how do I personally run my own flywheel? How do I think about this? And that ultimately comes from a previous video that I made, but I'm just gonna say it again. I'm just gonna say it again here, which is ultimately the daily videos serve as a content plus documentation plus learning feedback loop. So these daily videos ultimately serve the function of me being able to document my builds, what it is that I'm constantly learning on a day-to-day basis, as well as having this as documentation and content, and running feedback loops as well. What am I getting right, what am I getting wrong, and how can I just constantly improve that as well? And also using the newsletter to ultimately repurpose knowledge plus audience building in a different medium. So basically a different mode to ultimately have people that consume my content and want to learn a lot more about what it is that I'm building on a day-to-day as well. And also building that credibility loop, so that I'm also able to build that credibility in that specific realm, which is newsletters. And also focusing on client systems, which is the number one thing, ultimately focusing on client systems, how we deliver them, and this ultimately results in practice plus revenue plus case studies. And this ultimately means that I'm just constantly focusing on making sure that we're running the reps, that we're building, and we're also making sure that we're building case studies as well, that ultimately fuel how we're then able to build these videos as well. But that ultimately means that each and every single thing The key of this is ultimately that all outputs feed into each other. There are no siloed work, so nothing is individual. It's all about stacking so that they all work with each other rather than siloing each and every single thing so that it's, structured in a way that is unstructured, or we're just focusing on, running those reps that don't really make sense if we're not siloing it. So if it was more siloed, then shiny object syndrome would obviously kick in. That's what I meant to say. That shiny object syndrome would most likely kick in, but I believe shiny object syndrome only kicks in if things are not flowing into each other. And if it may not seem like that on the outside, then ultimately just internally, just making sure that we're doing things that are ultimately feeding into each other and are not adjacent, so they're not standalone. They don't work in their own right and they don't power anything within the business, because then I think that's when that's when you fall into the trap of shiny object syndrome. But how can you start building your flywheel today? Ultimately, identifying repetitive tasks that matter, systemizing each and every step that ultimately allows you to then scale, and also tracking input, adjust and iterate as well. So adjusting what it is that you need to adjust, and also making sure that you're stacking outputs across multiple channels so that you have outputs not just on one sole channel, that you're also understanding how the other channels also interact, and stacking multiple outputs through that as well. And also protecting the flywheel by prioritizing high leverage tasks is also the important mode, to make sure that you're just focusing on the most important tasks and not getting drained by the low ones that ultimately aren't scalable and don't serve a function within your specific business use case and even your daily life as well. So like I said, this is my own personal take. This is how I'm thinking about this, and this is how I am implementing it as well into my own personal life and also business as well, in terms of building at Killer Chaos OS, which I have not spoken about in a while. I will make a update about that pretty soon, to share like what's been going on specifically around that. But yeah, if you guys want to connect with me, make sure to check out the newsletter. It's the first link in the description, and also check me out on X, LinkedIn, Instagram if you want to connect. So yeah, if you guys enjoy this video, like I said, check out the newsletter, check out X, LinkedIn, Instagram. They're all in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next video.